In Nashville, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or sometimes referred to as Snickers, turned their attention to the utilization of Boynton and started to plan bus rides. This was not the first time there was an attempt at desegregating the buses that were a primary means of public or mass transportation throughout the South. And it was all buses. You had Greyhound, you had trailways. There was very little rail service between cities. If you wanted to go someplace, you took the bus. Previously, James Farmer, then titular head of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, wanted to dramatize a Supreme Court ruling styled Morgan versus the Commonwealth of Virginia that made segregation on interstate buses illegal. That is, you couldn't segregate with whites in the front and blacks in the rear. By buying seats on a bus from Virginia throughout the South, he wanted to go through Virginia, North Carolina, on to Kentucky. These were so-called safe states. This test in 1947 ended in North Carolina, where Bayard Rustin and 11 other riders were arrested and convicted for violating that state's segregation laws. They then spent 21 days on a chain gang. What did a chain gang look like? Most of 21 days. This is a North Carolina chain gang, 1947, and this is what you do for employment while you're on the chain gang. Rustin, in later years, continued to be at the forefront of the civil rights movement and was a very key organizer in Martin Luther King's August 28, 1963 march in D.C. And like everything else, here's the marker today. And what does the marker say? In 1947, the Congress of Racial Equality and local citizens, black and white, protested bus segregation. Setting out from Washington, D.C., Freedom Riders tested compliance with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling barring segregation on interstate buses. On April 13th, riders arrived at the local bus station, then 20 yards west. A mob attacked one rider, 4 others were arrested and sentenced to 30 days on chain gangs. Now let's move on to 61. CORE planned another bus ride that would start in D.C., go through the South, and eventually end up in New Orleans on May 17th, which was the anniversary date of the Brown decision. 2 buses, a Greyhound and a Trailways, left D.C. on May 4th of 1961. There were both white and black riders on these buses. And if you'll see some of these dates, I kind of pondered over this, but they had layovers on the way where local black communities would take in the Freedom Riders who would spend days with them before resuming a ride on a bus. So it wasn't just one bus. And this is a picture of some of the Freedom Riders on the initial buses, both black and white. And they weren't the only people on the buses. The first stop was in Fredericksburg, Virginia. There, the whites-only signs had been removed at the bus terminal, and the same when they reached the Richmond terminal. The riders deboarded at Petersburg late in the afternoon and were met by hosts, members of the NAACP that Roy Wilkins had set up as a support system in every community where riders were to stop, which is what I was talking about before. Public accommodations for blacks were few and far between in this day and time, and if any of us saw or read about the movie The Green Book, that kind of tells the story of the way it was. You had to have the Green Book to know where you could go and where you couldn't go, because where you couldn't go, you could get in real trouble. Real trouble in those days was a lynching and disappearance. The Ku Klux Klan caused a lot of people to disappear. The next stop was at Farmville, Virginia, where whites-only signs were still in the terminal and were freshly painted. However, this was not enforced, and the riders were served at the lunch counter in Farmville. The riders proceeded to Lynchburg, Danville without incident, but in Charlotte, a rider was arrested for trespassing when he tried to get his shoes shined. Rock Hill, South Carolina was a different story. Here's the first stop that's commemorated, but then we get to Rock Hill, and there was a reception committee. When approaching the whites-only restroom, John Lewis was accosted by some whites, and when he stated he had a right to be there in accordance with the Supreme Court decision, was told, quote, "Shit on that," end quote. The whites then descended on the riders, commenced to beat them until the police arrived. However, the attack did what the riders wanted. It drew a lot of publicity to the Freedom Ride. May 13th was a bellwether day. The Birmingham Police Commissioner, Bull Connor, and we'll see a lot of Bull Connor in future presentations, and his deputy, Tom Cook, organized Klan members to attack the buses in Anniston, Alabama. The plan was for an initial assault in Anniston, and then, if necessary, a final assault in Birmingham. When the Greyhound bus reached the terminal in Anniston, it was immediately surrounded by white men with pipes and clubs. They were cursing and beating on the windows. Finally, the rear tires of the bus were slashed. The driver got back on the bus, sped away from the bus station with about 50 Klan vehicles in pursuit. After about 6 miles, the bus had to stop. It was running on rims. About 200 people surrounded the bus and smashed the windows. Then someone in the crowd hurled a Molotov cocktail through the back window, and the crowd attempted to keep the doors closed in an effort to prevent anyone from escaping. It was their intent for all the riders to burn to death. Fortuitously, there was a law enforcement officer on the bus who was armed, who pulled out his pistol, showed it to the mob outside, and they then let people exit the bus. Of course, the bus was destroyed completely. And here we have the usual plaque that on May 14, 1961, a Greyhound bus left Atlanta, Georgia, carrying among its passengers, 7 members of CORE, also known as the Freedom Riders, on a journey to test interstate bus segregation. The bus was met by an angry mob at the bus station in Anniston, where tires were slashed and windows broken. Upon leaving Anniston, the bus was followed by the mob to this site, where the driver stopped to change the tire. The crowd set the bus on fire and attacked passengers as they departed. The incident served to strengthen the resolve of the civil rights movement. So there were only 7 members of CORE on the bus. At this point, no arrests were made. 12 riders were taken to a local hospital, but only 1 was admitted. The trailing bus, spread on to Birmingham and to the terminal there. Quoting newscaster Howard K. Smith of CBS, and this is a quote, "Toughs grabbed the passengers into alleys and corridors, pounding them with pipes, with key rings, and with fists. One passenger was knocked down at my feet by 12 of the hoodlums, and his face was beaten and kicked until it was a bloody pulp." And this is one of the hospitalized Freedom Riders. Years later, during a congressional investigation, it was shown that the Birmingham police and Klan leaders conferred prior to the buses arriving, and the Klan was assured that they would be given a free hand to do their will with the riders before police would arrive and move in. As set forth in John Lewis' book, Walking with the Wind, when Birmingham's chief of police, a man named Bull Connor, was asked why there were no police at the station when the bus arrived, he answered that it was, quote, Mother's Day, end quote. We try to let off as many of our policemen as possible so they can spend Mother's Day at home with their families. After the violence in Birmingham, the Freedom Riders were in disarray. James Farmer of Corps had decided it was too dangerous to go further and wanted his riders to fly to New Orleans in safety. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was John Lewis' organization, then based in Nashville, was adamant about completing their mission and got reinforcements from Nashville in order to proceed. The riot had become national news, and as a result, as we will see on these maps, because it was national news, more and more rides were organized, and you see all of these, all of a sudden there was one, and then you've got multi rides coming from all parts of the country down to the South in this summer. President Kennedy and his brother Bobby, then the Attorney General, and the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights were thrown into the fray. It was relatively early in the Kennedy administration, and no one had any experience in the civil rights arena. And it was just a month after the disastrous Bay of Pigs fiasco and 2 weeks before a scheduled meeting in Vienna with Nikita Khrushchev, a time when Kennedy was attempting to show the Soviets his resolve. The last thing the administration needed was a show of weakness at home. Bobby Kennedy called the governor of Alabama, one John Patterson, who neither answered the call nor returned it. That is, until 5 days later. Bobby sent John Siegenthaler as his personal representative to Birmingham. Siegenthaler was from Nashville and sometimes later became editor of the Nashville Tennessean, which was then the morning paper. Every city had a morning paper and an evening paper. They had the Tennessean in the morning and the Nashville Banner, which was ultra-conservative, in the afternoon. In Chattanooga, we had the Chattanooga Times in the morning and the Chattanooga News Free Press, which, when I say ultra-conservative, that's an understatement. I can remember I just learned to read, and my mother and I would read papers together to reinforce my reading habits. And this has nothing to do with this course, but the Chattanooga Evening Paper, Roy McDonald was the editor, and he came out with an editorial that all the working man needs is $1 a day and a pair of overalls. That's conservatism. That's conservatism. That's the way it was. Siegenthaler ultimately became a founding director of USA Today. A contingent of riders led by now deceased Congressman John Lewis took a bus from Nashville to Birmingham. Lewis had been on the original bus from Washington, but he had been contacted to go to some place, I think it was in South Africa, to do a presentation, and went back to Nashville, where he then lived, thinking that he was going to go out of the country. But all of this happened in Birmingham, and so he decided to stay, took a bus from Nashville to Birmingham with other people as reinforcements to continue the ride. At the Birmingham city limits, local police boarded that bus and immediately arrested 2 riders, one black and one white, for the grievous offense of sitting together. When the group less 2 arrived at the Birmingham bus station, they were kept on the bus for 3 hours, after which time Bull Connor arrived and put them in protective custody until he could round up patrol cars that took the riders north, saying he was going to take them back to Nashville. In fact, just north of Ardmore, Alabama, which literally straddles the state line, and in the middle of the night, he lets these black people out and puts them out on the side of the road. Now, if there's one place you don't want to be put out on the side of the road, it's Ardmore, Alabama. And if there's another place you don't want to be, it's if you're black in Ardmore, Alabama, because this is not a healthy place to be. The riders were able to find a black family, much to their good fortune, who put them up for the night. This was the same Bull Connor that, again, we're going to hear more about, and was quoted as saying, quote, if I can get into my more southern accent, "Long as I'm police commissioner in Birmingham, the niggers and the white folks ain't going to segregate together in this man's town," end quote. And that's who we're dealing with. The Nashville contingent was not to be deterred, and the next day they called Confederates, it was Diane Nash in Nashville, who picked them up and drove them back to Birmingham and to the home of Fred Shuttlesworth, a leader in the black community who was then and forever a leader in the civil rights movement. In fact, Martin Luther King once called him the most courageous civil rights fighter in the South. The riders were taken to the bus station where the police for once did protect them. And here we see Shuttlesworth lecturing to some of the riders on what to do and what not to do as the ride would continue. At the same time, Bobby Kennedy was negotiating with Greyhound to provide a bus for riders, and Siegenthaler, who had accompanied Farmers Group to New Orleans, met with Governor Patterson in Montgomery to try to ensure the safety of the riders who were then headed from Birmingham to Montgomery. And it was very, very difficult to find a driver who would accept the assignment of driving the bus, knowing what would likely happen when they got to Montgomery. Patterson convened the meeting with his entire cabinet, much like George Wallace in later years, and told Siegenthaler that, quote, he was sick of people backing down in the face of goddamn niggers, end quote. Finally, with a police escort, the bus headed south to Montgomery. There, the terminal looked deserted, but was not. Hundreds of people armed with bats, boards, chains, tire irons, and pipes descended on the riders who had exited the bus, as well as news people from NBC and Life. And try as hard as I could, and I could find no graphics of that particular incident. The Montgomery Police Commissioner, one L.B. Sullivan, and his men actually sat in vehicles around the corner from the bus station and let the mob have its way. Many of the beatings were severe, and one person in particular had injuries that would paralyze him for life. The riders eventually got sanctuary in the church pastored by Ralph Abernathy, who was joined by King, Farmer, and Shuttlesworth. A mob gathered outside the church, and after tense hours of negotiation between Kennedy and Governor Patterson, the Alabama National Guard arrived and escorted 1,500 or so persons who had gathered in the church to their neighborhoods in safety. The next day in the federal district court in Montgomery, the riders were successful in having injunctive relief to prevent the continuation of their ride dismissed, but Montgomery was under martial law. And here we see the headlines from the New York Times. And so the ride continued. Volunteers were coming from around the country, and the first two buses with National Guard escorts headed west toward Jackson, Mississippi. The reason I pause, there's also a Jackson, Tennessee. Despite the warnings of the NAACP's Roy Wilkins and his Mississippi deputy, one Medgar Evers, who we'll hear a lot about later. At the Mississippi state line, they were met by the Mississippi National Guard under the command of Sonny Montgomery, who would later serve in Congress for many years. A number of the guardsmen had been attending a Civil War reenactment group and thus resembled the Confederate forces of an earlier century. Now, for this audience, how do I describe this? And there were a number of lawyers who practiced in my court who did this. This was a big deal, doing these Civil War reenactments of the Battle of Shiloh, the Battle of Pea Ridge, the Battle of Corinth, and they would all dress up in newly manufactured Confederate uniforms or Union uniforms and have old muzzle loaders that I guess they shot caps in, and tried to reenact all these battles that had been fought 120, 130 years beforehand, and this was their hobby. This was their hobby. This is just what they did for fun. I never understood it then. I don't understand it now. At any rate, upon arriving in Jackson, the riders in the first two buses were protected by the National Guard until they got to Jackson, where the welcoming committee arrested them, put them in the local jail, and then to Hinds County to the prison farm. Now, Parchman Farm is not a very nice place, and if you're a believer in heaven or hell, the closest thing you could get to hell would be Parchman Farm in Mississippi and Angola in Louisiana. These were not very nice places, to say the least. So here we have some of the people that were booked from the bus, and in this photo, we've got other people who were arriving. And if you'll notice this young lady right here, and I got this from the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, is booking number 21034, and it's Vista's member Georgia Mordofsky, who is kind enough to be with us today, and I am going to allow her to tell you the story of what it was like to be arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, and spend the summer in Parchman Farm. And Georgia, thank you for being here, unmasked, and tell us about your summer adventure that you'll never forget.
First of all, what an honor and privilege it is to hear Robert again repeat this magnum opus of the civil rights movement. I have heard a lot of this. I've seen a lot of PBS documentaries and so forth, and I don't think anybody tops you. And I'm not saying this just because you're a Santa Barbara person or whatnot. You are really contributed something to the history of the United States, which is really unknown. And you also have brought forth a lot of the individuals. You mention them, and at least they are given some credit, because when I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, my God, we have hardly moved forward. We moved like 2 steps forward and maybe 3 steps back. And even this morning, I didn't even want to turn on the news because I didn't want to know what was going on. And so that's where I am at this point in my life. And in my dotage, I think during this COVID and everything, we've really had a lot of time to explore, even reconnect with old friends and so forth. And I'm sure you've all done that as well. So back 60 years ago plus, I wonder, where were you all? What were you doing? How many of you followed this in the paper? How many of you were involved in things supporting this or not understanding it? How many of you were involved in integrating schools where you went? Did you have a black friend? Did you reach out to someone individually? If you were a doctor, did you maybe take care of a black patient that couldn't get care from somebody else? If you were a lawyer, did you take the chance to represent somebody and maybe lose your whole practice? And then you mentioned these people being left on the side of the road, and a black family took them in. Okay, so this is what I was part of. I'm just was one little person, and the only reason that I think that there was any change at all is because there were millions of people in support of some kind of equality for all Americans. And so I'm hoping that maybe we can still have some of that history in our country. In any event, over 60 years ago, I was a student at Cal Berkeley, and one of the really funny things is this is Black History Month, so they had a special on Oscar Peterson, this famous jazz musician, pianist. How many of you have heard of him? Okay. All right, so when I was a student at Cal, one of the first benefits for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was a concert that Oscar Peterson put on. and it was sold out. And that was probably sometime maybe in March or something of that first period of time. So there were things going on all over the country, and I'm sure where many of you come from other areas, there were things going on where you live as well. So when they had the bombing of the bus and all the stuff that Robert was talking to you about, some of the people that were on that original bus went out to various campuses in the north because they decided their strategy was that if they could fill the jails, they could try to bring attention to this and close this down. And this is an interstate commerce law. It's not a local law, so it has to do with whether you can be in interstate commerce and be integrated. So they had a young man come and speak to us, and then probably there were probably at least 500 or 600 people at this thing, about his experience speaking on the bus and the bombing of the bus, et cetera. And this is what they were trying to do, recruit people to come there, to go to Jackson, that there was going to be a concerted effort to do this. And so I listened to it, and I thought about it, and it was very moving to hear the whole thing, as you can imagine. And I had the summer, I was going to go. I didn't have a job yet, and I kept thinking, I'm Jewish, and I kept thinking about this in terms of all what happened during World War II, and the people that lived in Germany and in the surrounding countries. What did they do? Why did they stand up? Would I have had any courage? And so I thought, oh, well, I can do this. You know, I'm strong. And so they had an interview and a psychological test and so forth. And they took about 10 of us from the Bay Area to be part of the Freedom Rides. And so within just a few days, it seemed like I was on a train with some other people, which were students primarily from Berkeley and a few people from Los Angeles. We were an integrated group, and we went on this train to New Orleans. And then in New Orleans, we had a nonviolent training program similar to what you were discussing, you know, not to talk back, to be polite, et cetera, that kind of thing. And that was for several days. And then we got on another train and took the train directly to Jackson, and along the way, people knew that we were on the Freedom Ride. So that the Pullman porters who worked on the trains were giving us food, and other people were trying to encourage us, and other people did not like it, et cetera. But anyhow, we got into Jackson, got off the train. There was the waiting station right there. We didn't even enter the waiting station, and we were arrested and put in a paddy wagon. We were told to, I don't know, I don't have a good Southern accent anymore, but move in or move out of this here place, and we didn't, and they arrested us, and they took us to the county jail. In the meantime, people are coming from other places, so the county jail is really crowded. And I was from Southern California, so they thought I was a mulatto, and they put me in the black girls' cell. And I would say there was probably like 25 of us in a room that would be like the even less than that, maybe a sixth of the size of this room, with one hole for a toilet and some horrible mattresses with blood and all sorts of crud on them when we wanted to go to sleep. You know, but this is the way the other people in the jail were. We weren't any different than they were. And the jail got so full that then they moved us to a county jail. That was a little more sanitary. And that got so full that they moved us to the state penitentiary in Parchman Farm. Now, I want to get back to the trial, because somebody asked about that. You asked about that. Okay, we were charged with disturbing the peace. And it was $300 fine or 6 months in jail. So we all, because the idea was to fill the jail, we all took the 6 months in jail. But in order to appeal it to the Supreme Court, you had to appeal it before 40 days. So the idea was that you would go in for 40 days. And people were coming from all over the country. There were, I don't know, fancy people like lawyers and college professors and, I don't know, some representatives from New York came. But they would come and stay for 2 days, like it was a publicity thing, and then they would leave. So there were over 400 of us. And I think that probably the amount that were in Parchman were probably about maybe 200. They separated the women from the men. And this is a maximum security prison. So anything you've ever seen about prisons, you know, even TV does a pretty good job. They gave the women, we had these fashionable black and white striped skirts, and we were kept in the on the death row in the maximum security part of the jail. So we were in a cell, and there was a cell block of probably maybe, I'm not sure how many cells. And there were anywhere between 2 and 3 of us in this little tiny area. And we all spent our 40 days there, and as it came about, we would get out. We did not get out for exercise. We did not have any books. We did not have any clothes. We were barefooted. I had the blouse I wore when I went in, my underwear, and the skirt that they gave me. We did not have any reading material. We had, after a while, they did give us Bibles. We did have toilet paper so we could play cards, just how we passed the time. We had the women apparently were very organized. This is all subsequently, this has been, there are a lot of oral histories and stuff like that. So the women were, we were organized. We had classes, we got up in the morning.
Segregated?
Yes, but next to me, like, there was I don't even know anybody from that group because we never got out. So there was a group of black women next to me on one side and on the other side, and we were the white ones in the middle. So we were all together, but we were segregated in our cells. And we made chess pieces out of soap. We played cards with toilet paper. They finally gave us the permission to write letters, so we broke off the lead off the pencils. We were fairly creative, but we learned a lot. It's like jail for people. I mean, the food is not good. There's no health care. There's nothing. And for us. The men I know were treated more harshly, and more of them were put in solitary. And I think we were more cooperative and united, the women. And I don't know if that's just a women thing versus men thing or whatnot. I wanted to go back to the trial because somebody mentioned that, because I think that's really important. First of all, we were represented by a black attorney who represented all of us, and I'm sure it was pro bono. I did have a jury trial. It was all white men. They charged me with entering a bus station, which wasn't even accurate. And I was guilty before you knew it. And each one of us was tried individually. So it wasn't a group thing. And so 40 days came, and bail was put up for us. And some of you may have even belonged to some of the unions that put up the bail. The people that put up the bail for me were the United Automobile Workers. But they put up, imagine, I mean, this is a lot of money to fund this whole thing. There were support groups all over the country doing fundraisers. I know in Los Angeles, where my parents lived, there were things at the sports arena and all this kind of stuff going on. And trying to think of anything else. it's been 60 years, and I really never went on the speaking tour or did any of this stuff until Oprah Winfrey had a reunion, a 50th anniversary reunion for the Freedom Riders, and she brought us all to Chicago. And so I wasn't going to go because my basic feeling about this is that I did an easy thing. I went there, I didn't lose my life or anything, didn't lose my health. I learned something about human beings, and I could go back to my community where it was much harder to deal with all of these issues of racism and just basically people being uninformed and not caring. And I thought it was much harder to deal with this on a local level, where you live, where you know people. And so I really hardly ever talked about it with it, never did anything like this. But when I was talking to one of my grandchildren about the Holocaust, and I mentioned something that it just didn't happen to Jewish people, it happened to other people, including Armenians and something else. She just, oh, I know someone who's Armenian, Kim Kardashian. Well, okay, so I was just so upset about this that when they had this Freedom Rider thing, I decided I would take them out of school and take them with me to the Freedom Rider reunion, which a lot of the people that Robert referred to were there, including Reverend Vivian and Reverend Lawson and all these people. And you have to understand that just like Robert, they're great storytellers. So my Southern California culture, I'm not a good storyteller, but there are a lot of people that are great storytellers. And these individuals would get up early in the morning for breakfast, and my granddaughters would get to hear. I said, this is primary source material. Listen to this, because you'll never hear it again. So that made me decide that I could share my little bit with you all. And I did have to, getting back to the whole trial, the legal part of this all, the state of Mississippi decided they were going to bankrupt the civil rights movement. So they arranged for us to have an arraignment, and we had to come back after getting out of jail and going back to my regular life. I had to go back in maybe September for some kind of an arraignment, and then a personal arraignment. I had to go back in November again for not just a group arraignment, but a personal arraignment because of this going. And I don't really understand this going to the Supreme Court. But in any event, people always ask me this, they ask me these two questions. What did my family feel about this? That's one question. And what did I decide to do with the rest of my life after that? Those are the questions. So my family, I come from a progressive Jewish family. I did know black people growing up, and Asian people, and Mexican people. My mother worked at an integrated medical clinic. And so I just accepted people. Children don't do anything much different than just whatever their parents do. And I did go to a white high school that was desegregated when I was a senior. And actually the Ku Klux Klan from Inglewood came and surrounded our school with the police. This is Los Angeles, California. And
which school, Georgia?
George Washington High School. It's in Watts. And I did go to school in Berkeley. Just to give you, we have made some progress. When I went to school in Berkeley, I don't know how many of you even think about this, black students, unless you were an athlete, there was no place for you to live except in the co-op. And this is California. This is not the Deep South. So as we all know, we live with a lot of prejudice today, and we're very tribal, and I'm glad that the government is doing something to at least have some commemoration of some of these historical things. It's very important. I don't know, the educational system, we're getting a great education here. Our young people need to get this kind of education as well, because otherwise they don't understand it, and we become very tribal. That's how I would describe it. That's how I feel it. Okay, so people want to know, what did I do with the rest of my life? Well, when I was in jail, I decided that all the people with PhDs and lawyers and this and that and the other, they were of no practical help to anybody that was there. What were the problems that the other women were experiencing? Well, they had problems with their health, constipation, ulcers, wheezing. So I decided that I would go back and become a nurse, because at least I could always get a job doing that, and I could always have something to say and do. So that's sort of my story.
Georgette, was your conviction ever overturned?
Yes, it was. If it wasn't overturned by the Supreme Court, I could never have gotten a job as a nurse. Okay? Yes.
I know we've got a lot of questions, so please ask them.
Yeah, it'll help me unclog the memory.
What was your time like at Parchman Farm?
It was in one cell. I think we got out maybe I was in there like 35 days, maybe 4 times to take a shower. Otherwise, I was in the cell the whole time. I exercised, I sang every Broadway musical play from the beginning to the end. That's what I did.
How many people in the cell?
2 to 3. Just like you see on any TV show with just the bunk beds. If there were 3, one person had their mattress on the ground. So the little toilet and a little sink.
What were you served to eat?
Oh, that's really interesting, because that also affected our health. Okay, so my mother was into health foods and stuff like that, so I knew beans were good to eat and stuff like that. Other people would not eat beans, so they served us for breakfast. They would serve us molasses, a biscuit, and a cup of milk. Well, molasses is really good. It's high in iron. Okay, so I had that. I drank my milk. I even ate a half a biscuit. That wasn't too bad. Lunch would be beans and white bread probably, and a cup of milk, something like that. Dinner would be a variation on the same theme. We had almost no protein. Once we had I don't know what you call it, pig skin with fur on it, with, in whatever. Well, on 4th of July, we had fried chicken. That was a big deal. We had peaches. Occasionally, I would say the peaches, put the peaches in the milk, take the biscuit, make dessert, right? So, but a lot of the people just would only eat the white bread. I wasn't going to eat the white bread. I had as many beans as I could eat. And, I lost some weight. But I could, when I came out, I'll give you this one remembrance I had. When I came out, I was barefooted. And the sun, the heat and the sun and the warmth of that felt so good on my body. I couldn't believe being can you imagine people that have been in jail for years and years and years that never see any daylight, particularly if they've been on something like death row or something like that. It is just really, our justice system, it used to be, I think you're supposed to re-educate people and stuff. It just seems like just recycles everybody, they come out. We've got a lot of work to do in this country and in our world. Yes.
When did the Supreme Court overturn?
It was I think about 2 or 3 years after I got out. I don't know. And it's sort of a famous case because it has to do with interstate commerce. Do you know that? I mean, lawyers know those.
Is this a U.S. or a Mississippi?
No, U.S., federal.
Oh.
It's a federal thing.
Georgia, did any of you ever file a civil suit?
Okay, let me get him first again. But
So the fact that it was delayed 3 years or
Two-
whatever didn't interfere with your choice of nursing?
No, I didn't know that if you were a felon, you couldn't be a nurse. Okay?
Is there a felony charge?
Well, if you have to sign on the thing, have you ever been arrested and whatever? And I remember even when I moved here from New York, I had to fill out this thing, have you ever been arrested or for whatever? And I had to write down what I had been arrested for.
Yeah, I asked if any of you ever filed a civil suit against the authorities who put you there.
I never thought of it. The idea was not to get money or anything. The idea was to have some social change and to change people's hearts and minds, which it did.
For a while.
Well,
Did you go back to Berkeley after the episode?
I actually went back there to recruit more people for this stuff, but I went. Do you want to hear the whole story? This is a story. Okay, I'll give you the whole story. Okay, I had to go back for this arraignment, to the first arraignment. And so I went back to Jackson, and there was a bus that was dropping off people. We had hired a whole bus, the movement, to drop people off in the different cities as it went north, like in going to Tennessee, Kentucky, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked the people, I said, is there any extra room on the bus? Because I haven't seen my relatives from Boston in a long time, and I would like to see them. And they said, well, it's going to New York, and if you agree to give a speech to this thing, we'll let you do, we'll let you do this. So I said, okay. So I went to New York City, I'd never been there before, went to this big auditorium, huge auditorium, and I gave a talk there about my experiences, much better than this one, I'm sure. And it was more in my mind, I'm gonna be 80. So I gave this talk, and then I went to a party, and I met a young man. And the young man was very aggressive, and I somehow decided I'd never been in New York. I would stay a couple of days, and then we dated, and before I knew it, we had fallen in love, and I just realized if I went back to school at Cal, I didn't know what I was doing at this point, and so I decided that I would stay and work in New York. I went to visit my relatives in Boston. When I went to Boston, I was on all these radio shows. My Boston family had all these connections with different people in the media and all this stuff. So before I knew it, I was being escorted to this famous person or this other person to tell my story, and then they would write out a big old check. I used to go around with a button that said Freedom Riders, and I was standing out in front of the United Nations one day, and this man came by and stopped me and asked me what this was, and I told him. He said, come with me. And I went with him. I was 20 years old. I went with him, and he introduced me to all these people that I now see on TV. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it just sort of gives you an idea. So I had to stay. So I met my husband, and we married, and I stayed in New York and went to nursing school and so forth. Yes.
Are you willing to tell us what your view is of the situation today as far as the racial injustice is? What your experience?
I'm obviously I have a big mouth, and I like to exercise my jaw, and it isn't just the black and white thing. It is something that's happening in our whole world of, I'm not sure what it is. It's the haves and the have-nots. It's climate change. It's people migrating. It's fear. And I think we're just in very, very dangerous times. That's how I would address it. I think we're all very much more tribal. And I think that how we get our information, everything is very strange. Okay? And I don't mean just like the right and the left. I'm talking about young and old. And we live in very strange times. I'm sure other generations have said this as well. But I fear more for the planet, and I feel most for how polarized we all are and how we can't even speak to one another in civil tones, etc. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I am.
No, but thank you.
Yes.
Well, you made a number of references to you being Jewish involved in this, as am I. And I grew up in, I'd like to expound on that. I grew up in and around St. Louis, which is the home of the Dred Scott case, border state.
Right.
And directly observed a lot of segregation. And especially my father's family was very involved in integrating the St. Louis City school system. One was the president school board, another was the alderman. But it led to a lot of anti-Semitic outbursts against me personally, my family. A lot of this activity precipitated a lot of anti-Semitic activity directed personally at my family because we were Jewish and because we were involved in this Civil Rights Act, this integration activity. And I wondered how this impacted on your family.
I'm so glad you asked that question because this is really a really interesting thing. Okay, so we're in Jackson, Mississippi, which is the soul of this whole place. The rabbi in Jackson, initially when we were there, of course you have to understand that all the congregations around the United States were saying, my granddaughter is there, do something, etc. Okay, right? So they brought in some food, some candy bars and stuff like that when we were in the county jail or the city jail. When we got to the penitentiary, I guess there was such a upheaval from the Jewish community and others that the rabbi came out to speak to us, and we were allowed, this is the only time we ever got out of our cells, we were allowed to go have one meeting with him. And so a couple of the black girls went too, okay? And I mean, that was good. And I remember he was trying to be, have us say our prayers and that kind of stuff. And some of us were saying, well, what about this issue that we're here, there? And he really didn't he was in a dangerous place. I found out subsequently, which is most interesting, is that, first of all, the Jewish community in Jackson was organized, and they were supportive of a lot of the black community. They were being really scrutinized by the authorities. They had their places bombed. There was also a lot of things that will never be written up in history that happened during that period of time that was done to various people. And I'm not talking about things done to Jewish people, took it upon themselves to, I don't know, it's even probably public, I don't even know. But they did some enforcement themselves of some of these people.
Could you follow up and comment on how you feel about the subsequent estrangement between blacks and Jews?
I think that is sort of, has a lot to do with power politics. And again, follow the money. And I'm not saying, I'm saying, but positions of power in city governments and patronage and all this kind of stuff that happens to all ethnic groups. Okay? And so people use divisions, I think, to separate us from what are the important things. And most people most people are not, if you get to know people on an individual basis, they're not for that. But a lot of people use it for their own self-interest, whether they're, I don't care what their ethnicity is or whatever, to keep their land, whatever they want. And so I think that, and people are influenced by it, so that I know that there are many black people that are anti-Semitic, because this is sort of something that's been pushed, particularly by some black nationalist groups and so forth, and also because the Jewish community has been sort of the community above them. They've been the retail stores people, the whatever, but you have the same things. You have this in every grouping, okay? And so that's how, I don't know if that really addresses, I just think these are things that divide us. And I try not to be involved with people that are only into power and to being mean. I don't do that. Yeah. Jill?
Do you know if the black freedom riders accepted the white ones who also were arrested and imprisoned as co-equal members of the movement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There was no anything. I think that depending on the people's, a lot of history we don't even know. One of my very dear friends, who's just practically is sort of going to the happy hunting grounds as we speak right now, was one of the organizers of Freedom Summer, which you may have heard a lot about recently, registering people to vote. And there was this guy, Robert Moses, who was this black man who should be feted like everybody else, but nobody even knows about him. He is one of the most important people for our country. And he was best friends with my friend, who is white and Jewish. My friend who is white and Jewish is the person that basically organized the whole Freedom Summer. Never has, his picture is almost never shown. Nobody ever talks about it. He didn't want to be known. Diane Nash is another person. She wasn't interested in the power. She was interested in the idea. So we always have these people. I mean, we have it in, I don't care whether you're black or white or whatever, Republican or Democrat. We always have these people that just push themselves and for themselves. And the rest of us, we're the rest, right? We have those people. So if we don't vote, if we don't encourage our young people, et cetera, to pay some attention to this, maybe we get the planet we deserve. I don't know. This is happening all over the world. It's not just our country. Yeah.
What was the percentage of black and white at the time?
Oh, it was primarily black, and it was mainly Southerners.
But I mean, from here was mostly from the West Coast?
Oh, from the West Coast, it was mainly black. There were like maybe, I think out of 10 of us, maybe 4 of us were white and 6 black.
So I'm curious, how old were your granddaughters when they went with you, and what was the impact of that on them?
Okay, this is really interesting. Okay, they were like 12, okay? And out of that, I started this thing called Granny's Book Club, where I got together with them and we would read different books about different groupings, things that I thought were socially, ethically, would help them in their development against Kim Kardashian. Okay, and I even intrigued them. We read this book. It's a graphic novel called Persepolis, and we read that. And then we went to a Persian restaurant. So I intrigued them with food, and this kind of thing. So I really tried to develop with them that particular grouping. The other ones are a little bit. All of them are doing. None of them are racists. They're victims of the times that they live in. And they do know more about celebrities than I would ever care to want to know about. And this kind of vapid stuff then about our country. But that's partially our fault too, because maybe we don't engage them enough. I don't know. This is a quandary. All of us, we're old. We see what's happening, right? I mean, how many of you are really concerned about these issues? I mean, we all are, right? Well, I mean, none of us can go out, I mean, I'm not going out on a picket line. I can give money to things that I support, or candidates that I support. I can vote. I can try to be good neighbors to even my Republican Trumper neighbors, who are basically decent people. They just think differently than I do about a lot of things. And, but we're decent, and we help each other, particularly in this COVID time. You can't be this way. It's not right. Yeah. I'm sorry for pontificating, but it's just, I just want to say one more thing. I couldn't even turn on the news this morning before coming here because I thought, oh my God, what's going on in this world? And I thought, you know, I haven't seen anybody, and I pay a little bit of attention, talking about accidental nuclear war from this kind of thing. What are we, where are we? And so I'm in a quandary, as all the rest of you are, I'm sure. Because we all have lived through, we've had life's experiences that have made us think differently, or think the same, or just wonder. Oh, please don't. Oh, I have one more thing I want to just tell you, one more thing. So talking about regular people that participated in this, which is basically, wouldn't have these changes if there weren't people that really pressured the government to do any changes. Tonight there is going to be on PBS a documentary on Fannie Lou Hamer, which is probably a person you've never even heard her name. She was a black woman that fought for the right to vote. And when I think of her, it brings tears to my eyes, because this is the kind of American that we want to have. And that's why she needs to be known about, and we need to talk about the whole voter, the ability to vote in this country. You know, it's a big issue.
That's next week's subject. We're going to hear about it.
All right. Anyway, thank you, Robert. You've done so much.
Thank you, George.
Don't, please don't. Please don't.
Well, here's the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, which is really at Drew, Mississippi, whose most famous son was Archie Manning, to sports enthusiasts. Look what they have here. They've got the prisoner running and the dog chasing him. It kind of tells you about what that place was like. See the bloodhound, the footprints. This is what's going to happen to you if you try to get out. It's 21,000 acres there. Now, the other thing at Parchman that people overlook, the state of Mississippi always looks for revenue because it's a very poor state. And for many, many years, they rented out the prisoners to farmers in the Delta for $9 a day. And that's how they paid for Parchman Farm. And some of the laborers earning their keep. Alan Lomax, who did a lot of work for the Smithsonian and recording blues musicians throughout the state of Mississippi, did this photo of Parchman Farm. This is not a very nice place, and as I said, Parchman and Angola and Louisiana are about as bad a prisons as you could find any place in the country. Next week we get into voting rights. We get into the people Georgia talked about. And here's John Lewis at Parchman. 59 years ago today, I was released from Parchman Farm Penitentiary after being arrested in Jackson for using so-called white restroom during Freedom Ride of 1961. Just one of his many arrests. So next week we go to voter registration. And thank you all.